On the heels of yet another boat strike launched by the United States military, one that killed 4 people, there are growing calls from lawmakers in both political parties to release the footage of the now highly controversial double-tap boat strike in September, which has called into question the legality of the actions of the United States military. A selected group of lawmakers received a briefing on that September 2nd boat strike, which killed 11 people in the Caribbean and has been questioned as a possible war crime for what has been described as the military firing a second strike on distressed and shipwrecked sailors who survived the first strike. Congressman Jim Himes, the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, described the footage that he saw as some of the most troubling things he has seen in his years of public service. Another House Democrat, Adam Smith, who was also briefed, described it like this.
We saw the whole video from the moment that they identified the boat to when they did the first strike. And by the time of the second strike, you have 2 survivors with their shirts off on top of a capsized boat. The bow of the boat is above water, but there's not much above water. And they're on top of that boat. And that was what the decision was to strike those 2 people on that boat. So it's very disturbing. Now, you know, the Admiral offered an explanation for why they felt that those 2 people on that boat were still, quote, in the fight at that point and legitimate targets. But I have serious questions about that conclusion.
The New York Times is reporting that multiple people who have seen the video of the attacks say the survivors climbed on the overturned hull and waved to something overhead, a gesture interpreted as an attempt to surrender, beckoning rescue or trying to signal other alleged drug traffickers. But the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, and now some Republican lawmakers are trying to argue from that briefing is that the 2 survivors, the 2 people shipwrecked in the water, clinging to a boat that had just been incinerated, were exhibiting behavior that led them to believe they were preparing to continue on whatever journey or mission they had been on before they were bombed, that they were, quote, still in the fight. At this point, it's important to remember that here's how Pete Hegseth describes the fight.
We also don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. We untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. No more politically correct and overbearing rules of engagement. Just common sense, maximum lethality, and authority for warfighters.
For its part, the Wall Street Journal editorial board is calling out that man, Pete Hegseth, for the position he's placed the men and women in the military in, and those directly under his command. Wall Street Journal writing this, quote, "It's notable that Mr. Hegseth has spent the last few days saying he wasn't in the room when the second strike happened, even as he declares his full and total support for Admiral Bradley. It smacks of an attempt to shift scrutiny to a military officer who can't defend his decisions in public. The message to other officers is that they'll be alone in a foxhole if some mission runs into trouble. But the administration will have to start explaining why it is asking men and women like Admiral Bradley to open fire," end quote. That's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling is here. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Also joining us, Atlantic staff writer Missy Ryan. She covers the Pentagon and the State Department. With me at the table, Media Matters President Angelo Carasone is here. General Hertling, I start with you. You have been talking us through this story just about every day this week, and I wonder how you see things on this Friday.
I think you teed it up pretty well, Nicole. It has to do with something that hasn't been mentioned, I don't think, other than by me, and that's the fact that in the military, there's something called commander's intent. Commander's intent. What you see in your commander, your superior officers or civilian leaders, and what they display, what they communicate, the kinds of things they say to large organizations. And if we were to run back all of the things Secretary Hegseth has said since he's become Secretary of Defense, he has repeatedly used this mantra of, do we get rid of these unnecessary rules of engagement? We're focused on lethality versus legality. There have been multiple times where he has publicly said that. You don't have to give an order when you give those kinds of statements, when you're the leader of an organization, because people start picking up on it. From the standpoint of a guy that used to be in the military, what I'll tell you is hearing the kinds of things he has said to open audiences and directly to some people, I got the message, Mr. Secretary. That's what you want to do. So, you know, whether or not he gave the order, he was in the room, there is now an atmosphere or an aura surrounding that commander's intent. And everything you just said in the opening statement about how he's trying to divorce himself from the issue and put the emphasis on Admiral Bradley is absolutely correct.
General Hurley, we've learned about this one incident because there's been a lot of smoke and swirl around it. You had a high-level resignation from Southcom. You had this explosive Washington Post story. The act that the Washington Post describes is the act that was briefed to Congress yesterday. And that act is still, as I think you were one of the first to point out to me, the actual textbook example in the laws of war of where the line is. And so I wonder if you've heard anything since you first sort of made that argument to us that leads you to understand better why the second strike on the 2 shipwreck survivors was deemed appropriate or legal.
Nothing in my mind or things that I've talked to other retired and active duty officers about justifies that second strike, that restrike. And by the way, I'll make a comment too now, Nicole, the term double tap, in my view, is a bastardization of what special operators use when they engage human beings and they shoot twice very rapidly to kill a target that's threatening them in a close-in raid. That's not something you do with 45-minute intervals. What is called is a restrike, and it's purposeful. And there were times to think of, or there was a lot of time to think about it during that period where, depending on what you've heard from the members of Congress that heard it, there was anywhere from 48 to 2 hours between the first strike and the second strike, restrike, and then the third and potentially even fourth one. This was not a double tap where it's meant to kill the enemy immediately in 2 successive strikes. This was a planned operation, and there was delay between the different strikes. So, no, to answer your question, no, I haven't heard more about it. But in putting myself in that situation, that period of time between the first strike and the second strike would certainly give any commander on the scene time to consider what he was doing and why he was doing it. And then, again, that takes us back to the commander's intent.
And does that, I appreciate the note on double tap. I will abandon that term immediately and use restrike. Does it obscure or sort of render as pablum the idea that there was a fog of war or that no one knew what was happening? Your point is that they had time to get eyeballs and make an assessment of the damage that had been done from the first strike?
Well, yes. And what I'd say in addition to that was this was the very first strike against the boat, a boat, as I understand it. So it was the first time executing one of these strikes against a cigarette boat or a drug narco trafficking boat or whatever you want to call it. It was the first time. So there is always confusion in the first strike. And that's the true definition of fog of war. It has nothing to do with smoke or atmospheric conditions. It has to do with confusion, chaos, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. So when you do that first strike and you have the kind of results that they saw, and yet there were some additional people who were not killed in the strike, then they had to figure out, what do you do next? And it appears over the next couple of strikes to new boats, to other navigation, they had figured it out that, hey, what are we going to do? Do we collect these individuals who are not dead after a strike? Do we take them as prisoners of war? Do we gather them up and then ship them back to a country without any trial? So there was, I believe, and having been in combat, there's always confusion on the first strike, even with special operators. So I think that all plays a part in this entire thing. And one of the things that connects all this, as you just said, is what are the other people saying? I keep going back that I think a key witness to all of this is going to be Admiral Halsey, the battle space commander, as it were, as the Southern Command commander. He had a fight, or at least some contentious comments with Secretary Hegseth. He also had a lawyer who had those same contentious comment. I think some of that testimony is also going to be important to setting the context of all that happened on that day.
Missy, let me show you some more of what the people who have had eyes on the video of the first and second strike and have watched this entire chain of events have said. This is, first let me play Adam Smith talking about it, and then Jim Himes.
Because their definition of return to the fight was they considered it plausible that the cocaine was still on that boat. I find that somewhat questionable as well. It was hit by a strike. It was on fire, visibly burning for a while before the fuel tank separated and then capsized. Is it possible that there was still cocaine underneath the part of the boat that was underwater? I suppose. But there's no evidence of that. And also, what does it mean that the cocaine was still there in terms of these two people still being a threat and in the fight?
I don't want to get specific here, but there was no radio. There were two individuals clinging to flotsam. That's what there was. There wasn't weaponry of any kind. There wasn't a radio. There was no means for them to communicate other than the fact that the fire and the smoke was fairly well visible for a long distance around, but there was no radio.
Missy, in those descriptions, do you hear anything that suggests there's any distinction between the example written in the Laws of War manual about how to treat survivors of a shipwreck and what was briefed to Congress yesterday in terms of the video they saw?
It's a great question, but the distinction that I see is actually the administration's maritime campaign, which is newly militarized, and it's taking over what has traditionally been a Coast Guard and law enforcement domain, Coast Guard interdictions, law enforcement prosecution, intelligence gathering. And this is something unfamiliar and new for the U.S. military. And the other crucial distinction, and potentially more important, is something that General Hertling referenced earlier, and that's Pete Hegseth and the way that he is leading the Pentagon, the messages that he's sending down the chain of command about what is and isn't acceptable. And, you know, I've covered 9 or 10 secretaries of defense, and since Hegseth took office, when we started doing all these sort of unorthodox moves in his leadership of the Pentagon, I've really asked myself, what is the lasting impact that he's going to have on the institution? And I think that this is starting to give us some clues in terms of how this impacts operational decisions that are occurring in the military. And, you know, I think some of these things are always going to be debatable in the moment. And I think when you have a campaign that puts criminals, people who have traditionally been viewed as criminals, not terrorists, in this new light, this is really uncharted territory for the military itself.
General Hertling, let me bring you back in on the point Missy's making. I mean, that Hegseth is changing the military was, I suppose, unavoidable based on who he is and how he crossed Donald Trump's radar. They first knew of each other because Pete Hegseth was on Fox and Friends on the weekends, championing the cause of two members of the military who had been through the military's justice system. Hegseth wanted Trump to intervene, and he did over the objections of then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. That's their connection. And I wonder if you think that Pete Hegseth has changed the culture of the military, if you think that he has now put men and women of the military in the position of being accused by Republicans and Democrats of carrying out possible war crimes.
There has been an emerging trend over the last couple of decades, Nicole, of politicizing the military. And it's something that's discussed in war colleges and command and staff colleges in every one of the services, case studies, this kind of thing. I think that there has been an attempt to bend the military, to take them away from their apoliticalization and also their oath of office. I don't think it's going to break the military. I agree with Missy. Some of the things that are happening right now are going to be case studies in the future about the adherence to the rule of law, an understanding of the personal courage that's involved in standing up to subordinates and say, we're not going to do that. what to do in those kind of situations. The military has been through these kinds of tests before, and they've always usually improved and gotten better afterwards. But certainly right now, it's a tough time. Because as I said before, as I'm listening to the key leader in the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, he's sending messages, and so is President Trump, about what the military should and should not do. And it happened in the first term of the Trump administration as well, in terms of establishing a palace guard, having parades, using my generals, my military. Those are the kind of things that I think impinge upon a culture which my experience over 40 years in the military is that it's a very strong culture. We are taught things in different schoolhouses, but it's certainly being tested right now. In the future, there's going to be a lot of young officers and NCOs that are looking back on this and saying, wow, how did all this happen?
Yeah, because, Angelo, I mean, that will happen in the future because what happened in the past resulted in the example in the Laws of War manual being this example of how one treats shipwrecked people.
Yeah.
That is the line that has been drawn based on the study of history.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, we talk about that as the study of history, but a big part of what Trump and all the people around him are engaging in, and the right-wing media underneath it, is revisionism. A lot of this started with a revision of what our history is, and that is a big part. So ignoring it is key. And that's, I think, to me, the biggest piece of all of this is that the narrative or the story that they're sharing is one in which we've been fundamentally weak, and somebody like Hegseth is going to go in there and change the culture, and that is what he promised to do, and that's what we're having now is this fantasy. The story that he had been selling for so many months starting to become materialized, and obviously it wasn't well thought out, and you have all these operational issues as a result of it. And that, to me, then, if you add it all up, if you look at what the coverage is in the right-wing media and Trump supporters, it's either they're ignoring it or they're confused. They don't know whether or not to be upset or to celebrate it, because this is now conflicting with the reality. So, for instance, Hannity wants to give Trump credit for these killings. He's been saying that this is an example.
But Trump doesn't want to take any credit or have anything to do with the second strike.
That's exactly right.
Trump's been asked publicly twice, and once he said if there was a second strike, I wouldn't have approved of that. And when he was told by Jim Himes, one of the video release, he said, yeah, I'd release it.
And that, I mean, that should, and yet Hannity still wants to give him credit for it. And he still attributes it to him. Says, well, this is an example of the kid gloves that Joe Biden put on the military coming off. And, other Fox News hosts like Jesse Waters are giving Hegseth all the credit. The Chirons read, finish the job, right? So they want to celebrate it. Other parts of the right-wing media are saying, well, we don't like this. This is too far. This is confusing. But the majority are ignoring it. And I think that is, to me, the illustration that they've ignored all the history. They have their own narrative, their own version of it. It's obviously been a fantasy. And now we're seeing that materialize into reality.
No one's going anywhere. I want to play some of what you're talking about, what the right-wing fantasy sounds like.